Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Gio and Joey Show, talking politics from a Protestant point of view. Joey and Sam, how you guys doing today?
Better than I deserve.
Doing great.
All right, Joey, take it away.
Yeah, so I'm actually really excited for this episode. So this is Sam. He's a friend of mine. He's a fellow Reagan Republican. We're both with the Reagan Caucus, trying to restore the GOP to the party of Reagan and Bush Senior and Eisenhower and all those great American statesmen who But part of the reason why I wanted to have Sam on, well, the reason I want to have Sam on is because I feel like one of the issues where we don't have enough honest, like good faith conversation is foreign policy, right? Like, for instance, right, like doing the primaries, right? Nikki Haley, who was my candidate, I happen to know it was Sam liked her as well. But constantly people would say, oh, well, she's just a warmonger. She's just a neocon. It's like, well, okay, first of all, that's assuming that I'm assuming your premises are correct about the neocons just being warmonger, whatever, and it's not. But secondly, so that's the first premise that's dishonest. And then the second one is like, Nikki Haley wasn't even advocating for a neocon foreign policy, but it's just like, it's as if your policy disagrees with what the current narrative is. It's just you want to be written off as like a warmonger or a neocon, whatever. And so I figured we'd have Sam on so we could have like an actual kind of long form conversation about an actual like sane conservative foreign policy, right, that supports the American led world order. Um, but yeah, I guess the first question I'll ask you though is, what is your sense of the American foreign policy scene of late?
Well, I think today is a great example because right now the DNC is ongoing, and you have both AOC followed by Hillary Clinton, who have just completely stark differences in their foreign policy. As we've seen, AOC's really visceral hatred of APAC versus the old school consensus that Hillary used to follow. Um, I just think overall, both parties are extremely divided on foreign policy, and it's largely intergenerational. It's, along other political divides in terms of more established, older, established voices and mainstream business voices versus the more populist wings of each of their parties. What I think was so interesting and kind of funny in the 2024 primaries was exactly there was this mudslinging name calling of Nikki Haley and others in the primary as representing an old view from the second Bush administration, when she never served in the second Bush administration. She served in the Trump administration, and actually a lot of her policy focus in terms of our different defense industrial needs, calling out China very adamantly, calling out Cuba and Venezuela very adamantly, those things were not popularized under Bush one or two, under Reagan, under Eisenhower. Those things were popularized under Trump, and Trump was the one that was really forthright and sometimes unhinged on social media in
Trump?
criticizing foreign leaders. And she's showing an evolution of that, but I think this constant need to like look back and label things as necessarily this, things are just evolving. These are new circumstances, these are new countries, we're dealing with new world leaders, and we need to evolve. um Obviously, I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the past, and particularly from the success of the Reagan administration in terms of foreign policy and the different voices that were in that administration. But this way in which we're going about it and kind of categorizing things when there's so much nuance is, it's not a good idea.
Yeah, very good. Because I one thing I was kind of thinking on that is like there's two guys that paradoxically I appreciate them both, but they're actually quite different. But like I feel like they represented a time when American foreign policy was conducted by statesmen who were really thinking about these things. So Henry Kissinger and Ronald Reagan. Now Kissinger obviously was he didn't place the same emphasis on values the way that Reagan did, which is why I land with the cowboy, I land with the Gipper, right? That shouldn't just coexist with communism, but we should roll it back, right? Like versus Kissinger just wanted to taunt. but at least, like, yes, there was heated exchanges, but at least these were two people offering like a coherent platform. And so I guess I'm going to kind of, because based off one of the things you said, I'm going to kind of bring it this way, is how do you explain like the dichotomy between Trump on foreign policy, between Trump's basically somewhat decent foreign policy in his first term versus the types of things and the kind of vibes that him, like, he's kind of unleashed on the right with the more isolationist paleo-conservative wing, right? Like where like the JD Vance pick seems to be going, right? What's that dichotomy? Like what's going on there, do you think?
Well, as you hinted at, it's completely categorized within the switch up from Mike Pence to JD Vance, and Mike Pence getting his starts in politics back in the Reagan and Bush eras versus JD Vance coming in more recently. And I think the challenging thing is, at the end of the day, with all this, Trump is extremely unpredictable and constantly changing his mind, and there's just, he has so many people behind the scenes that represent so many different wings of the party that are giving input, that to put him into a box is like exceptionally challenging. Even though I would say it's challenging across all presidents. Presidents are always not the perfect emblematic representation of one ideology or school to, foreign affairs. They have to be a little bit more practical and pragmatic. But he's obviously the biggest example of that. But I think that the clear sign that people of the wing of JD Vance and a lot of these organizations that have ties back to Orban's Hungary and Iran is extremely concerning and really undermines what was the biggest strength of the Trump foreign policy, was its ability to call a spade and call out examples of really terrible leaders across the globe, regardless of whether it might be in our best interests in terms of oil or other supply chain things, to just remain peaceful with them. He was able to call that out and call out examples of, democratic backsliding in Latin America. But this new wing seems a little bit more, I think, taking further than the Kissinger example, where Kissinger was trying to mitigate extreme risk with some of the larger countries at the time, obviously being the Soviet Union. And it's now this willingness to be open to, Viktor Orban, who is frankly no military threat to the United States, no threat to our influence in Europe, and can be easily managed if we have strong leadership. But they're seemingly willing to just, turn a blind eye to it, and that's really concerning. And this is not to say that there's not things to be said about the other sides turning a blind eye to visceral hatred in this world, but on our side, I think it's most important to call out your own people and point out those around you. So I think it's a very important thing for us to be speaking up about on the right.
So let me jump in here, just to make it a little bit more practical for people who are listening. Like, put yourself in Trump's shoes. Him coming in, let's say if he wins the election, he coming in January. How do you think he deals with Ukraine, what's going on in Israel, and what's happening in Venezuela?
I think to reverse the order, finishing with the most important conflict, in my opinion, I think it's pretty clear that the Trump administration will toe the line of very clear criticism and potential use of some sort of intervention against the Maduro regime. I mean, his very close advisors are from South Florida politics and a lot of the Cuban and Venezuelan community down there, and have been very crystal clear on that. And I think that's a great sign of progress, if in the case that he's the victor.
Well, Joey's been calling for the CIA to take him out.
But it's a bit far. But
Yes.
I think on the same side, I think that the Republican Party at large has made crystal clear their commitments to Israel, and they would continue to arm support for Israel outside of this strange hysterical fit that Candace Owens has been throwing. Pretty much the party is united in its support of Israel. I think the most concerning thing is the way in which the the vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, and those around him have been willing to toss around the seriousness of the Ukraine conflict as just sort of, oh, I don't really care what they think, is what he said in some shape or form. Really no interest in continuing our aid programs with a lot of misrepresented claims about the financial side of it, and acting as if it is not a big deal. And if everyone should know it is a very big deal. It's a very large country, and Russia obviously being a very serious threat to the United States in a number of shapes and forms, both in the defense side of things, the cybersecurity side of things, and their cultural influence in our media and information. But they've seemed to toss that around, and I can't make a crystal clear prediction of what Trump is thinking of doing. I'm much more on the analysis side than the prescriptive policy side, but I would say that it seems very clear that they will not continue another aid deal, and they won't make more importantly, I think, our public vocal commitment to Ukraine as strong as the Biden administration has done so far, and other voices have done so far, including the Speaker and Senator McConnell.
One of the things that I find just so frustrating about our political moment is, as a lifelong Republican, right? Like, we've been vindicated. If only we weren't like just getting rid of the football now, because it's like the famous moment from the 2012 debate, right, where Mitt Romney is asked, "What is the greatest geopolitical threat?" And he said Putin's Russia, and then Obama mockingly derides him as like, "Oh, well, the 1980s called and wants its foreign policy back." It was like, well, Mitt Romney was correct, obviously. I don't know that I would actually. Okay, maybe I'll back. He was correct in that they're geopolitical. I don't necessarily know I'd say they're our greatest one, and I think it's probably China, but they're certainly right up there with China, right? They're certainly part of this new axis that seems to be forming against American power. But it's just Republicans have decided that we don't want to take the winning. We've been right, we've been vindicated, but now we just want to abandon the argument, right? Which is it's disturbing to say the least.
Well,
Um,
let me
100%.
go ahead, Sam.
I was going to say 100%, and I think the problem I have so often with the way in which these kind of IR discussions go about with some of the mainstream voices is that you're comparing apples to oranges between Russia and China, and identifying one as bigger than the other is it okay, like, great, that's like a debate to be had. It doesn't change anything about our policy. I mean, obviously China doesn't pose the same threat to foreign oil supply, as obviously Russia plays a big role in the Middle East. But obviously China has way more cybersecurity threats to the United States. They pose a big threat to our trading partners in Southeast Asia. So it's so funny how people start trying to economize it that way and saying, well, we can't do all these, we have to focus on one, and that's just not how governing works. The governing isn't like project management of your like daily life. It's a big organization of many people that can do a whole lot of different things.
Yep.
yeah.
One of the talking points has been that during the Trump administration, there weren't these wars, right? Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine, Israel, they had the peace accords. The border was under fairly more control. How much of that do you really think was Trump's influence, or just maybe pure coincidence during his terms? Because, you know, Putin doesn't seem like a man that would back down on anyone.
Sure, I certainly push back against the categorization that, Ukraine or other conflicts, you can't predict that. And to say his individualized influence, I think you can probably give some credit in terms of uh, neutralizing North Korea. It seems that he seemed to have a very clear personal role in that, given the state of the relationship with North Korea and how our diplomacy is done with them. But yeah, I think it's such a false. It's a total mess when people say, well, so and it was better under so and the economy was better, or this issue was better because of one policy. A lot of these policies we don't see the effect until much, much later. I think foreign policy stands out a little bit from that because, where you place your military or how you act in diplomacy can have very quick impacts versus economic policies. I mean, it takes a year for them to enact a tax policy and for it to take effect and then the money to move around and people's wages to adjust and stuff. So I think that whole conversation is a mess and people totally forget, like, we had COVID in the middle of all that, which
Hmm.
totally threw it up. But I think in foreign policy there's some seriousness to be taken there, and I think that the concern that needs to be continued to be voiced is that for a good while now on the left, there's been a lack of clear moral clarity and firm, kind of harsh public leadership. And what I mean by that is that you need to speak with a very firm tone and verbiage when talking about these foreign conflicts. And the Biden has failed to extensively talk about Ukraine in the way he should have been selling it to the American people the whole time. And we've really, I mean, have you ever heard either of them talk about the threat from Iran in public? I have not seen an interview done on that. And that's, I think, what people say that they liked about Trump was even the mean tweets or some public display of that, you know,
Yeah.
scare factor a little bit in those foreign dictators, and that's what people are looking for. But I don't think his unprepared and unanalyzed way was a very good way of going about it. But maybe it's a little bit better than what we're getting right now.
Yeah, there's a reel going around of someone asking Vice President Harris, "What would you tell Iran?" And she just replied one word, "Don't," but gave no context. Don't what? Don't stop building nuclear weapons. Don't stop killing your people. Like, don't what? And she never gave any context. But, well, go ahead, Joey.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, so you mentioned something that I think, well, I want you to expand on that. I'll respond afterwards. But so what you said about on the Democratic side, right, this lack of moral clarity. And I feel like that's the part of the foreign policy conversation that gets lost the most, right? Right, because you have, I guess what you'd call them, right, like the America First, right? You'd say like a kind of realism, right, where it's just all about hard, cold political facts and self-interest and whatever. And like that's a part, right? That's the kind of the more sophisticated version of that is that's the Kissingerianism. Obviously, he wasn't an isolationist like America First, but that cold, hard, right? Just geopolitical, self-interest or whatever. Versus what in my opinion, right? Like I think the most important strength that America's leadership has had is the moral side of it, right? So what role do you think there is for like a moral vision to a successful, good foreign policy?
Yeah, and I'm going to touch on that from, as you're talking about, on the Democratic side problem is the liberal interventionist wing of people are very closely tied with the more Reaganite values-driven outlook. I mean, obviously, there's a little bit more focus on the international institutions, and I think, we've seen the problem of failure to call out anti-Semitism in the UN, a failure to call out some bad trade agreements that have happened. Um, but I think that the moral outlook is the biggest missing factor in our foreign policy. And I think that the thing that stood out to me in the past year was that Nikki Haley seemed to be one of the only people that could articulate that in a way that it has so many bigger consequences than just in terms of like the actual policy being implemented in the Department of Defense or the State Department. It impacts our social cohesion and issues of polarization and partisanship. To recognize that common American identity and our common focus as we act as a nation on a foreign state. There's not Republican members of the military and Democratic members of the military. They're all our armed services. And so that is, I think, so important. And I think that the biggest focus, I think, that gets missed by these people that have been critical of the neoconservative Bush 2 era of foreign policy and some of the failures of their intelligence side of things was that the idea of standing up for human rights and democracy across the world is not a bad thing, and it should not be demonized. I'm firmly more in the critical camp on certain intelligence and national security things that have gone too far and have undermined some of our freedoms and individual liberties. But that doesn't have to be mutually exclusive with some sort of isolationism. It doesn't have to mean we have to, yeah, assess every conflict from whether or not it's going to make us richer. That does not work in the long run, and it's a lot, like your cold calculus today in terms of our foreign or international spending um, can completely change when critical resources are controlled by a dictator next decade. So it's I think the moral vision needs to be focused on who we are as a country, who we were founded as, and our commitment to making sure other people pursue those ideals, and then leave room for a very serious case by case debate about how that is done, what is the most appropriate means in each circumstance, what is the least uh, risk, what is the level of risk, whether or not it's going to be seen it's going to be effective. Those are questions to be had after, but laying out our commitment to our allies, our commitment to freedom is critical.
That's so important. And like I want to have like more conversation about just exactly, where Bush Jr., where W went wrong. But I feel like more of the time I'm end up in a place where I just have to defend him from this kind of baseless attack. So in other words, listen, I do think there's room. I mean, any president, right? There's room to have criticisms, right? Or this idea of the practicality of certain actions that we took, right? Like, did we ever have, it's debatable. Did we need to go into Iraq, right? Like, I think probably maybe we didn't. But this idea that seems to be commonplace on both the right and left now, that W was some sort of monster who just wanted to go into Iraq to get oil to enrich himself. I'm like, well, first of all, if you want the oil from the Middle East, you don't invade the country. You just get some cozy relationship with some dictator, but you get Saddam and you cozy up to him and whatever. Like, there's ways to get the oil. No, at the end of the day, right, Bush W ran on a more domestic policy driven agenda, right? Like, he ran against kind of the liberal internationalism of Clinton. He's like, we do need to come home more. And guess what? A giant wrench was thrown in at the beginning of his presidency, right? And at the end of the day, he was not a neoconservative, right? That's not how he started. But at the end of the day, when it came to a plan to actually do something long term for the war on terror, the neoconservatives were the only people actually offering a coherent plan. So we can criticize that plan. I have some criticisms of it, right, where I don't think it was practical. But this idea that it was some cynical thing, like, no, like, it wasn't. These were good people, right? Like, one of my favorite people, right? Somebody I know we're both fans of, Condi Rice, who I think is phenomenal. But like, at the end of the day, these were people who had a moral vision, right? So when in Bush's second inaugural, when he talked about we want the world to be safe for democracy, he meant that. And I think that's a good goal. But like you said, we do need to have a little bit more prudence about what resources should be allocated where to do this. And yes, there are some times where I think, and this is where I think, at least my view is that the morals, we should always know what our morals are, so we know that whether we're moving in the right direction. So for instance, with Saudi Arabia does not have a view of human rights that I'm comfortable with. But since they've interacted with us, things are better in Saudi Arabia than they once were. And so
Substantially.
I'm okay with that because it's going in that direction. Particularly, and this I will give some more plaudits to the Trump administration, but at the end of with the Abraham Accords, we were moving on a path towards Saudi normalizing relations with Israel. I think that would be very good, right? So like, if we know where our moral center is, if we have to do some things that are not yet at our level of human rights or democracy or whatever, but we're pushing our foreign policy in that direction, I think that's as good as it gets in a fallen world. But I don't know. Do you have any other thoughts on that? Or
Yeah, I just think it's so important to evaluate this on a case by case basis. And yeah, and when we're analyzing history and looking for lessons to be learned from history, it's also important to remember the practicality side of it. And, it's so easy to go back and find things to criticize about decisions that were made in the past because have the insight now of what happened afterwards. Well, you don't always have that foresight. And um, yeah, I think I'll leave the Iraq war to another day, but I think it's really important for people to look at these circumstances individually. And I think on the Ukraine conflict right now, um, as you were saying, it's important for us to assess the financial side of things. And what we've been seeing is a lot of complete nonsense. I hate the word, but misinformation being spread about the way in which the military aid is being provided. And it's, I think, a complete demonstration of the Biden administration's failure to sell this policy and failure to sell, frankly, our role in this conflict. Because it's very easy, and there's been great scholars from AEI and the Hudson Institute that have laid out, how are we doing this? Where is the money actually going? And it's paying to replenish the supply of that stuff, old stuff that we're giving them. But they're not doing that. They're not playing an active role in the public education of that. They just think if they just shepherd this through in the behind the scenes, it'll go fine. And it's causing all these divides among people and losing a lot of people then to the terrible excesses of isolationism and whatever that ideology is.
oh, we can't hear you, Gio.
Yeah, let me soften the conversation here a little bit. Instead of war, let's talk about other things of foreign policy. What's happening in England with the hard censorship of free speech there in their own country. And whether true or not, it seemed legit, about pursuing and extraditing other people from other countries for for tweets or Facebook posts they don't like. How would you handle that, and how would you want your president to handle that? Because that's a joke. That's never going to happen. But the threats are being made.
Yeah, and I've been very outspoken and critical of different attempts to overregulate our tech, overregulate our internet, and push whatever your preferred worldview of information is, or, oh my gosh, this existential risk of AI with just a lot of complete nonsense being spread
Hmm.
about what, people that are, it's like there's some groups that are people with like a high school education telling you, oh, they know all about the capabilities of AI. And you're like, it's a very sophisticated thing. I don't claim to have any knowledge of it, but I do know that, maybe we should talk to people that have designed it. Maybe we should talk to people that are using it constantly. It's like all things. You should talk to the people closest to them. Same thing. I think, um, as we were saying about, being able to criticize your own side in terms of politics, the United States should be very comfortable with voicing its opinion on its allies and voicing its opinions on what its allies are doing in their own country and
Hmm.
where they're maybe undermining freedom and individual liberty and democracy. So I think whoever the next president is, I think the current president, if he's awake right now, should speak up and
He's gone.
say
Look,
something about this.
look. And the reason the Biden thing is personal to me is because my father died of Alzheimer's, and
Yeah.
I could see it. I could see the cognitive decline in Biden. And actually, even though I don't agree with the majority of his policies, I feel bad for him because I saw my dad, who was a great man, decline and become a shell of himself. And for them to be still propping him up like this and basically embarrassing him, when history, if we should live another 50 years, when history writes back, it's going to be a farce what they are doing to him.
Yeah, and so being from the tri-state area, I mean, we've known about him forever. My parents were the
Hmm.
biggest fans when he was vice president. Um, I think what is getting lost in this whole conversation about, what was a terrible debate performance and his stepping down from the ticket and his kind of strange end to the presidency of the one, yeah, it's just like the president of the United States, regardless of who they are or what they believe in, we want them to succeed. But also the true loss in terms of one of the last big icons of a whole generation of leaders. And I agree. I disagree with a lot of the stuff that his administration has done, a lot of stuff he said over time, but he represented an old way of going about diplomacy and statesmanship that I don't think we're going to see for a good period of time. It's neither tickets seem to show it right now with either their people, and a lot of the options to come next don't seem to show it in the same way either. So it's just a huge loss for our country that instead of shepherding in the next great statesman after him, whoever that may be, in a race between, I don't know, Nikki Haley versus, Mayor Pete or something, that's not happening. Right now we have two tickets that are a hot mess, and he's not able to oversee a seamless transition. I don't know what's going on in Washington right now. So, yeah, and it is so sad. I have two very old grandparents now, and it's hard to watch, but there's not much we can do on the
Yeah.
outside.
So let's peer into the future. Trump wins. He has 4 years. Obviously, he can't run again after that. Do you think he fades into the sunset as far as influence in the party, or he still will try to manipulate things? What happened, Joey?
I said Don Jr., God help us.
Oh gosh. Well, I think same thing as Biden, depends on his well-being. He's old too, and I mean, how much of a role he plays, I think, is only going to be determined by that. Obviously, he's very invested. Obviously, he has strong opinions and harsh critiques of different members of the party. So I think he will, if he can. But whether or not he's still there with us mentally will determine that. I think what's so concerning about that is obviously step one was picking JD Vance, and regardless of how active he is, on the campaign trail in 2032, which I just can't even think of happening right now, he paid that pick preemptively, and it's clear determination of a shift within the party towards organizations and people that he thinks should be his next replacement and be his legacy pick. What I think is so interesting is the way in which people are talking about, if he wins this election, that's a surefire thing. One, we've all seen J.D. Vance is not the greatest politician. He's not the greatest campaigner. And I think you put him on a debate stage against just Nikki Haley, let alone Ron DeSantis or somebody new like Tom Cotton, Dan Crenshaw, whoever. I don't think he's going to perform well. And he's shown a lot of likability problems. I think they said polling this morning that came out that he's more unpopular than Sarah Palin was. So
mercy. Yeah, but you know what?
no
At this point, though,
determination
no,
that's the
but you know
future.
what? At this point, though, I stopped trusting polls in 2016
True. No, that's true.
for both
think-
sides, really. Because I mean, nobody thought Trump was going to win, right? And none of the polls, were
Yeah.
predicting that.
I'll defend the polls. So the polls in 2016, like, they actually were not that far off, right? And Trump didn't. In other words, Trump. So in polls, right, there's a certain percentage, right, chance, right, that if everything goes
Margin
this
of error,
way,
yeah.
Yeah, margin of error. Yeah.
it's not that the polls were wrong. It's Trump pulled the ace in the hole, right? In other words, no one in 2016, including, listen, I am a two-time Trump voter, right? Reluctant Trump voter, very much so in 2016. A little bit less reluctantly in 2020. 2024 with the election stuff, I can't go back. Right, like, I voted for him because I didn't like Hillary Clinton. I didn't expect him to win. I thought Hillary Clinton had it, right? In other words, and Democrats who the progressive left, which thought Bernie got shivved, they
He
also
did.
weren't. Well, he got shivved legally and through
Yeah, I
process.
know, but
The Democratic Party
Corrupt
did what he
system.
ought to do
hmm
to keep bad candidates from winning. But that's a whole other conversation.
yeah,
We
yeah.
would find Jonah Goldberg hat here in strong parties. Um, but at the end of the day, right, like Democrats were not enthused, progressives were not enthused to vote for Hillary, and they didn't think Trump could win. And so a lot of Democrats stayed home, and Trump's base turned out in full. So Trump was able to win, right? And 2020, no one didn't believe Trump could win, and so everyone on the left voted. And I don't see, again, I don't know who's going to win. Nobody does. It's going to be a close election. But let's just say this: I don't think 2016 can happen again because I think Democrats all believe Trump can win because he won.
Uh,
So,
My
what was your
my my analysis of 2016 is a little different. I think that where the polls were off was mostly in the people that do not want to be associated with Donald Trump in their lives. They don't want anyone to know that they're voting for Donald Trump. It carries huge reputational risk at this point, and just like, playground conversation or,
Yeah.
your local town. I think, unfortunately, with the way in which the Democrats have handled a lot of situations most recently, and particularly uh, the gross scenes of violence and riots in our cities in 2020, and then again on college campuses this past spring, as well as the handling of the economy, there are there I tend to pull it all by a couple of people that I know that are kind of fall into the camp that they don't talk politics or post anything
hmm
politics or associate, but because of course working in it, they like to confide in me and ask questions, and you can tell by the way in which people ask questions is is there great permission for me to vote for him this time is the question that's being asked, and it seems clear that there is a good. Again, I think it's going to be very narrowly close, and I think pretty obvious it's going to be decided by Pennsylvania this time. And those handful of couple tens of thousands of people that may go in there without being represented in any kind of polling or public posts and pull the lever one way or the other will decide that. Now, there's a lot of things going against him with those people, too. Obviously, as you said, January 6th is a huge red flag, and there's been a couple people that maybe used to be that way, but now it's a non-starter. I do think that the J.D. Vance pick hurt with that a lot, and I think if it had been Doug Burgum or Glenn Youngkin, it would have been a guarantee, I think, with those people, and then a guarantee with other people outside of that crowd. So it's gonna be close, and I think starting tonight, the convention, how the Harris campaign portrays itself, and then how the debates go, we're gonna see what happens. Obviously there's also huge upsets that could happen. There's ongoing conversations between Israel and Palestine. There's ongoing conversations with Ukraine and Russia. Um, Everyday threat of China, everyday threat of other things happening domestically. So it's going to be hard to see, but I think he has very much of a chance of winning with some of
all
those
right?
people that may publicly look probably liberal because they present that way and they live in those kind of communities, but they vote behind the scenes, and that's
Yeah.
what we have a secret ballot for.
hmm
And
That being
I
said,
will
hold
say
on, let me
this.
jump in here, Joey, real quick. That being said, right, both of you have stated, and I agree that it's going to be close. But I think we have our different reasons for why it's going to be close. But that being said, I don't think it should be close, right? The way the economy has been so bad, the wars, the things that have been going on, it should be a blowout. But I think he's his worst enemy at times. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
I mean, he
yeah,
definitely.
yeah. I mean, all the legal problems, all the electoral denying, his public behavior, his inconsistent campaigning, and messaging and stuff. The
Mm-hmm.
undisciplined VP pick. I mean, yeah, it's all his fault if he loses. And at the same time, I think, um, that being said, with him being such a flawed candidate, if he wins, Democrats also only have themselves to blame because I think the pick of Josh Shapiro, I think having a more open convention with other options on the table, um, there was a lot of other options, and they have a deep bench. I think people underestimate they have a deep bench of younger people. They have a lot more younger people in high holding offices,
Mm-hmm.
um, but they can't. And the original pick of her as vice president was also had a lot of flaws in it too.
Yeah, go ahead, Joey.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I do think, and this is the thing I'm saying, like over and over, like this election is all about right self inflicted wounds, right? Like I just think like Jewish Americans have overwhelmingly supported Democrats, and yet the failure, like I guess to win my state, right? Like this failure by Democrats to just be able to say the basic thing that like Jewish students should feel safe on campus, right? And the nation of Israel has at least a basic right to exist, right? And like, well, I would say probably, not probably, a majority of Democrats believe those things, but they're not willing to, like, for instance, right? Like the Republican Party, it's got all of its problems, but at the end of the day, you don't see any Republican politician who's actually making excuses for, say, Nick Fuentes, right? But actually, I think now Nick Fuentes says he's
One
going
or
to,
two.
well, one or two, but I think now he said he's going to campaign against Trump because he's not adequately anti-Israel, and so it's like, oh, Trump's not anti-Israel at all, but the whole thing is, so it's like at the end of the day, like I feel like at least on the, while the Republican Party maybe doesn't police some of its members that I think it should, right? Like Marjorie Taylor Greene's and these people. At least with the extreme of the extreme, I think the Republican Party does do a better job of telling like the actual like Nazis in its coalition to get stuffed. With the Democrats, it's like I said, for me, the closest I came in this election cycle to being like putting on the red hat again was I was watching a speech from like 3 hours from where I live that was going on in Dearborn a couple of months ago, and this guy was getting up there and saying when we say death to Israel, we really mean death to America because America's. I'm like, oh man, you want to make me vote for Trump, don't you? But it's like that's how I feel. I feel like both parties. I watch these campaign ads, and I'm like, wait, why is Kamala trying to get me to vote for Trump, or why is Trump trying to get me to vote for? And I'm like, they should just Trump should hire Kamala to promote him, and Kamala should hire Trump to promote her because both sides make the best case for their opponent.
Yeah, I
Uh,
agree. I think there's just such a lack of discipline within
Mm-hmm.
both parties of casting out their worst excesses. And I mean, both of them, you had Marjorie Taylor Greene speak at the RNC. You had David Sax's bizarre rant at the RNC. And there's a bunch of terrible choices for DNC speakers. I mean, this is Jonah's case for a strong party. Whoever's the party chair should probably have final say over the speakers list, and the speakers list should be super cut down. I mean, you should just take anyone on there that's unappealing, anyone there that just speaks weird. Like, they don't need to be presented. Nobody cares. It can be the daytime speaker that isn't aired on national television. But
Is it
they didn't
is
do
it
that.
is it true that Jeffrey Marsh has been invited to speak at the DNC?
I, I would
I
doubt
haven't
that.
looked at the speakers list as
Uh,
much yet.
yes, there was stuff running around, and like I said, I was talking to Joey off air that a lot of stuff I see that I'll just talk in private because some of it is so far gone that I can't even
Yeah,
like take
same.
it as credible. But you wonder, right? Because this world is nuts. I mean, look what's happening in Denver and Aurora, Colorado, supposedly. with Venezuelan gangs taking over apartment complexes. Like, is that true or not? Right? It's like,
I hadn't seen that. Oh my God.
oh yeah, there's TikTok reels, not TikTok reels, Instagram and Twitter reels.
Oh, a little bit more credible.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, but that's what I'm saying. It's like I'm not saying it's credible, but I'm wondering
Yeah,
because you
yeah, it's
see, for
concerning.
example, this is real, right? What happened in Joey was there, right? What happened in Washington D.C. with the burning down the flag and putting up a Palestinian flag
I have this hat on because I didn't
I
wear that.
and
think,
and desecrating our monuments. Like, look, I'm huge for free speech, but you're advocating for another government. I mean, like I may be drawing the line there and cracking some skulls. You know what I mean? Like, it's just weird. Because you see
well,
what's happening in England, right? Like they're really the loonies are really running the asylum in England.
yeah, and I always bring that up because I used to fall a bit more on the left side of the aisle of things. Definitely in the political sense, because the threat of, the way in which Trump presented himself just was so unpresidential and unappealing to a young person. Um, but then we had, really violent protests happen in 2020 amid my high school graduation was canceled, yet, protests in the city streets were totally cool. And then I went and moved and was living in DC that fall for the first fall of college, while doing remote classes. And you had boarded up buildings, they closed the Lincoln Memorial. And when they tell you to deny what you see with your own eyes in real life off the screen, and
Mostly
when you
peaceful
hear people
protests.
say who they are, they say, I believe in death to America, or they
Yeah,
say,
yeah,
Israel
exactly.
doesn't have a right to exist. You should believe them, and we should be taking that seriously. And the way in which people will just kind of, well, I don't know, because, I stay in my, little hub bubble of life and don't see that ever. So that must not really be a thing. People talk about the border, well, I've never seen people pouring across the border. I've never been to the border. And you're like, well, that's an awful way to talk about it. You can say, that you think, you know, the way in which, Governor Abbott or Governor DeSantis have been handling themselves is abhorrent. You can say you don't like putting kids in cages. You can say how you think net in immigration is a good thing for our economy, not a bad thing. Those are like things to be said and discussed, but denying situations and crises ongoing and really discussing failures of government is not okay. And we should be critical of our government, regardless of who's in charge. Even if we voted for them and loved them, I think there's plenty of things to criticize them. Sure, if Nikki Haley or DeSantis had become president, as there is of every president, and that's okay. But the way in which we see people, oh, I don't see that, or now misinformation has become like a crutch for if I don't have time to research that or I don't want to research that,
Yeah.
then well, I don't know. You can't be too sure of anything these days. Like, no, well, it's true. You shouldn't be too sure of anything these days, but when there's stuff seriously presented and seriously reviewed by, I don't know, the Washington Free Beacon or other, the Free Press, other reputable sources, you should acknowledge them and we should address them.
One last question for me, because we're running up against time, is peer, put your, wizard hat on and peer into the future. Trump is out, right? He served his 4 years. He's done. Do we have his replacement in view? Like, will DeSantis, or is it somebody yet that we don't know about it who may be a shooting star? Or do you think it'll be an establishment person who takes over?
Yeah, I mean, I have felt the sense since the primaries, and I mean, we're slowly seeing how they're operating post-presidential run. DeSantis launched his PAC. Nikki Haley has been pretty active in the election so far. Um, I got a sense that we are awaiting who it could be, and that's not to say it's not somebody that's like currently holding office, but I think somebody in the vein of Governor Kemp, Katie Britt, DeSantis's attorney general, younger people that are maybe not at the crux position that they'll be holding when they're running for president, but are in office and they're and represent particularly a younger generation. ideally, um, are, I think, really going to show a sign. This, I think, what people are underestimating is there's going to be a bridge from Trumpism to what is ever next. People that act like, well, if we just, Republicans for Harris, and we then will replace the party later on. You're like, well, yes, but you've destroyed all credibility with like 80% of the party in the process.
Yeah.
So how are you going to rebuild it later on? So I think those of us that, voice our criticisms of Trump and Vance, and, might not vote for them, but are still willing to engage with people across the party and recognize that there are good and bad policies for every politician. That's going to be important. I think some of those younger voices that you've seen that maybe have endorsed him but haven't outwardly campaigned for him as much, or are just from, a more conservative state where it doesn't have the same stigma, those I think are going to be really important voices to continue to be watching in the coming years.
Okay. My last point is I long for a younger president. I'm tired of this geriatrics. Give me somebody who I would love to be somebody who's just turned 35 like and just barely qualified, and let's see how they run the country. Joey, any final question for our guest Sam?
So I have a final question, but first I say, so while I generally agree with you that it'd be nice to have a younger president, and like I support all that, except yes, she's older, but I still want Condoleezza Rice as president.
Oh, of
So
course.
take an older Condoleezza Rice. She's still sharp as a tack, and she's
Mm-hmm.
not that old. She's what, late 60s, early 70s. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So let's have an age requirement, but let's make sure we exempt 2028 Condoleezza Rice.
Hey,
No, okay.
Perfect.
But
well,
my last question,
go
kind of
ahead.
bringing back like an overarching foreign policy question, right? So my thing is like my big thing is like I feel like with the fall of the Soviet Union, right, and the fact that we won, right, free market, right, like freedom, right, free society, we won it, and in the aftermath, right, I think it's telling that Lithuania and Poland to South Africa and um, you know people all over the world, they don't really balk at the fact, they don't really get scared at the fact that there's U.S. ships sitting in their harbor or a U.S. base, in a country. Yeah, sometimes you'll get this, like, people talk online about like, American whatever. But at the end of the day, nobody in these countries actually thinks that like America is going to like get out and like, whatever. Whereas God forbid, had the Soviets won, right, what we would have seen is a world where everyone was trying to get, every small power in the world was trying to get their hands on nuclear weapons, right? There was been mass armament. Like people would not have just been happy to have a Soviet ship in their harbor, right? Like around the world, because the Soviet Union was inherently aggressive and actually colonial in a way that the American security umbrella is not. Um, and so like we see that, right? And we see the world.
Is there a question in there, buddy?
Yes,
Jeez.
sorry, because we see the world as it is, and yet everyone on both sides, the prevailing wind on both sides seems to be, let's get rid of this. Let's, we don't need this vast whatever we have. How do we, like, how do we sell a unified, um, consistent, right, moral American foreign policy that can be the new status quo, right, the new bipartisan consensus?
Yeah, and I think at its root, and in a philosophical sense, these new strains on both sides of kind of, yeah, we should take a step back and we shouldn't be standing up for Ukraine or Israel. We shouldn't be, doing trade with other countries. Is this naive idealism of isolation and America first, or whatever you want to call it. Um, Yet they claim to be realist. They claim to be the hard-nosed Kissingers that are making rational decisions for our safety and appealing to people as, no, actually a moral clarity and standing by our allies and all that good stuff is the real moral clarity. And the realist ideology versus isolationism is idealist. Isolationism is just, oh yeah, I can take my cake and eat it too, and I don't have to defend it. I don't have to, be strategic in the world,
Mm-hmm.
chessboard as it really is. That's really the idealist, and it has no articulated plan. If somebody wanted to say, well, look, we don't want to be active in this or that conflict because it's a bad idea for you know I'm certainly not supportive of sending boots to the ground in Ukraine or Israel. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
a step too far, and we don't really need to do that. But if they were saying, okay, I don't want to do that, but we should be active in this and that. There's a lot of democratic backsliding in Europe and Latin America, and so we're going to take a more active role in those and preserving what is already a little bit more closer to us. That would be one thing, but no, it's this idea that we should just like take a step back from all of it, or virtue signal about it and say, well, say stuff, but then don't actually mean it or have anything behind it defending us. So I think putting little teeth into things and targeting rational calculation. And then I think the most important thing is we have the message there. The moral clarity is the most appealing message because it wraps everything up in one blanket. There's just not enough people going out there and selling it. There's not enough groups that are critical of this isolationist and more pacifist lens that are voicing that, and then particularly, I think, with a younger generation and more apolitical people, I see all the time. I think we've seen that, Iraq and Afghanistan had such a looming impact culturally on a broader audience of people that are not usually tuned into foreign policy, people that are not usually very opinionated on it. And the more pacifist lens has latched onto that and used that as a justification of what we should be doing now. You haven't seen people looking back and saying, well, look at how Reagan and Bush oversaw the falling of the Soviet Union. Look at how Eisenhower and those before him stood up in these different conflicts and speaking about that and teaching about that and voicing that. And I think that if you give a clear voice to it, you will have people on your side. It's just a matter of volume and space and time.
Yeah, I think that's where this administration has been very weak. Obviously, we don't know what they've been doing behind the scenes, but the withdrawal in Afghanistan, the running of muck of Iran, and different things. If I were president, no virtual signaling. When I say something, it'll happen, right? But I'm big on diplomacy, but I do it all behind the scenes because that culture loves to save face. If you let them save face, a lot of times you can just get along. Hey Sam, where can people follow you if they want to interact with you? Where can they contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on X at Sam Raus 1, and I also post most of my interviews and articles on LinkedIn.
Okay, all right. Until next time on the Gio and Joey show, once again, thank you, Sam, for joining us and talking foreign policy. There's so much that could be said. There's so much going on globally, but everybody just keep your head on straight and stay focused on what matters most. All right, until next time, be well. Hang on.